So good evening to everybody. My name is Vittorio Aureli. I'm a professor here at the School of Architecture at the EPFL, and I'm director of the Institute. And it's my great pleasure to introduce you another episode of our lecture series, which, as you know, focus on housing, but this term actually more on the perspective of reuse. And within the context of this lecture series, we wanted to really take seriously, actually, also the idea of reuse in also radical terms. And I thought that, actually, we thought that this was a very good opportunity to use also the context of the lecture series to launch a book by a very esteemed member of our faculty, Charlotte Malterre-Barthes, who is a professor here at the school. She's very well known to you. There are many things to say, of course, about her. She studied first in Marseille, then she moved to Zurich, where she earned her PhD. She authored already many essays and several books, and actually I became aware of your work when you published in 2016, if I'm not wrong, the book Housing Cairo, which I thought was a really brilliant research, really on the topic of housing, from a, of course, very different perspective than what we usually assume housing to be. But recently, also through her teaching in other venues like the GSD, and of course also here at our own school, Charlotte actually has made a very strong argument for a global moratorium of construction, which is a sort of provocation to us to think what would happen if, for a moment, we would stop building new structures and instead focus actually on care, maintenance of what exists. I think it's a very strong argument which has raised a lot of interesting discussion. So I thought that this was a very good opportunity also to continue this discussion. I'm also very happy to see, of course, many students, but also a lot of faculty. So I think it's a really important moment for Charlotte, but also for us. And also I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Menna Agha, and she will be in conversation with Charlotte. She's an architect and researcher, and she's currently teaching at the Azrieli School at the Carleton University in Ottawa. And her area of research is design and spatial justice. She has extensively written on very beautiful place, the Nubian region, from a very interesting kind of perspective that includes actually questions of gender, but also community. So her work really focuses on not just building, but really the spatial consequences of urbanization and process of urbanization. And she, I think, perhaps the very, very good actually in perhaps introducing us or questioning perhaps Charlotte's work. So I'm very pleased to introduce this dialogue. I just want to say that there will be, of course, this is a book launch, so there will be also a book signing downstairs. No? Yes? No? There's a few copies that are being, no? Cyril, where is Cyril? Yes? Yes? So eventually you and Menna could sign some of them, but there will be also drinks, so it's also an opportunity to really celebrate the publication of this red book. I'm very pleased by the color of the cover. It reminds me another book, actually. I forgot the author, but thank you so much, Charlotte and Menna, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this kind invitation. To introduce you a little bit more to the things that I, not in a very smart way, do. I live now on Algonquin land, on unceded, stolen Algonquin land in Ottawa, or what is known now as Ottawa, which is the Canadian capital. I work at one of the 12 architecture schools in there, and the only architecture school in the capital. So we have a lot of burden that comes with being the public interest architecture school in the country. I also work with amazing students who identify as architecture activists, and we all together work in what we call the Architecture Action Lab. Most of our work is geared towards design build, which is something I've been doing for years, which wouldn't be surprising to you to know that when I attended the first the first workshop was Charlotte around the moratorium on building. I was thinking, that's not going to happen. And I think at that point I spoke up and said, well, not because some white dude telling us that we need to stop building, we will stop building. And underneath that, a lot of anxiety coming from being a Nubian woman, seeing how calls towards halting or calls towards covered within a green veil of environmental justice has rendered our cities or our built environment inapplicable. How environmental protections are used sometimes to dispossess indigenous people around the world. So I was very, very reluctant. And it was at that point when the discussion went forward and you started talking about reusing and thinking about the world otherwise, I was thinking, yes, I can subscribe to that. If we stop construction but keep building. And here comes this differentiation in terms and terminologies. And to disclaim before I go on that rant, building versus construction, what means what, is a dramatic issue we have in academia all the time. One similar to this is the differentiation between place and space. So here in Europe, place means something and space means something. You cross the Atlantic, it's the other way around. So I am not invested in trying to engage English as a language of, like I'm trying to solidify some term in English. What I'm trying to say here is that I would like to draw a very clear line between building, reimagining worlds, reworlding, reimagining the ways in which we assemble and we live and we go about this life from the construction industry that sits within a capitalist realm. So to me, I felt very inspired by this proposition, and I kept raising it, as I was telling you, in all studios that comes up, like the fact that we have this urge to build. And it also comes with a lot of burden with the whole title of architect. Who gets to be an architect? Can you get to be an architect without building? Can you be an architect, or is this a term only exclusive for those who have or who kind of follow that urge to build? And that brought me to what I kept thinking about, this concept about the urge to build and what it means to build. And this year, this was reignited by the new issue of the Ontario Building Code. The Ontario Building Code this year comes with a lot of changes, but the biggest change is that it redefines what a building is. And in its redefinition of what a building is, it basically makes it even easier for a building to be commodified. It also makes it that the easiest way to follow the code is to build anew. It's very hard to follow this new code with existing buildings. It has to do with the split levels and what can count as a building and what doesn't count as a building. In it as well, there are so many protections for buildings. It has to do with fire, it has to do with access for disabilities, but then there are things that the code excludes from being buildings, like mental institutions, like prisons. So it's not just that the code defines buildings, the code also does the ontological work of excluding some spaces from being a building or getting the protection of what a building is. So to me, this is a very big point of contention. It tells me that our struggle here is a struggle of meaning. What is it that we're trying to do? What what does it mean to build, and what is a building? And it seems like that this definition of a building is always in flux, but we don't really have control over it. We have to always abide by institutional definitions. And these institutional definitions are often follow money. And this brings me to this year, trying to get permits for two buildings that we were trying to do with communities. The first one is an adaptive reuse of a portable. And a portable is, portables are these buildings or these little containers that in the 1970s were used as office buildings in big construction sites. However, in really marginalized communities in Ottawa, these buildings came in and became donated to them, and they are the only public space available. In Canadian winter, I don't think you have the -25s and the -30s here, but in Canadian winter, these public interiors are the only place to gather. These spaces are the spaces where kids have their homework club. This is a community refuge. However, they wanted to demolish it because there were all the anxieties. This was built in the 70s. There is asbestos. We went around. There is no asbestos. We did the test. There is no asbestos. They really have this urge of demolishing this portable and building a new one. So eventually, we had hired a forensic engineer. We had gone through the whole process, and we convinced the owners of this, who are Ottawa Community Housing, our largest affordable housing provider in the city, and we convinced them that the portable is salvageable. We can have this be an adaptive reuse model. And then we tried to get to permits. And the permitting office was very confused. This is not a building. It's going to sit on helical piles, because there is a friction between the fact that the land is owned by the city, but the building is owned by the Ottawa Community Housing, so it has to sit on helical piles, on screw piles. So it's not a building, because a building needs to sit on concrete. So you see all these definitions. And then in another project, we have this public space that is basically decking and pergolas. Again, the permitting officer said, well, I don't see this meeting a building requirement. So eventually, the questions were, do we apply for permits or not? Of course, because they are all afraid of liabilities, we still had to apply for permits and pay thousands of dollars. But this contention that we face, not just on the kind of theoretical level, trying to define a building, but trying to design in a different way, outside of capitalist models, trying to design within this activist volunteer space, and going back to the institution saying, can we build? Can you give us the ability to build? Because if we don't go to them, they will demolish it after. We will be in legal trouble. And they would come back to us and say, oh, this is not a building. That means this struggle over meaning happens every day, which means that if we dare to engage world making, engaging with materials, engaging with existing spaces in a different way, we end up in contestation with the institution over the basic meanings of building. And this has been our kind of war cry for a few years now, which is the rematriation of building. We would like to think about how it would be if we rematriated, took back the definition and redefined what is building and what does it mean to build, and also who gets to build. So this brings me to the reading of your book and the reading of this amazing political project. We identify ourselves as abolitionist, and this is the project that you have presented. The project is not the exclusion of, how I understood it, is the project is not about the exclusion of world making, but the abolitionist stance that requires us to stop the harm right now, to have a chance to think about what else is there. So we think about it as abolitionists. That's me and my students who read your work all the time in our reading groups. And we think about it as actionable, and we can't wait to be your comrades and your allies in this political project.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Menna. I mean, I'm incredibly grateful that you're here to discuss this project, and the fact that you were there also at the very beginning. So, for context, maybe something a little bit different, something that I already mentioned, is that the idea itself kind of, I mean, I refer to it as something that has crystallized some kind of subterranean interest, or like maybe intuition. I know intuition is not a very popular notion in a pretty technical school, but the intuition that something was intrinsically wrong about some aspects of our discipline. I remember very early onwards saying, maybe we should not be doing that, and friends telling me, oh, there is this project by this obscure Bordeaux architect who did this place in Bordeaux where they just said you shouldn't build, you should just upgrade your maintenance protocol as a really foundational moment, and that's actually 95. So I have been contending with these questions since a long time. They just kind of were never really finding their way out, and then the pandemic kind of crystallized that. And the workshop you talk about is actually part of this. So maybe the difference with that book and maybe other books is that, or other ideas, is that they're incubating. Somehow people kind of think about it very hardly, or like they think about it hard. Not hardly, I already did a mistake today. But like they kind of sit with the idea and they kind of investigate it, and then they put out a book. So that would be now. But that idea was actually thrown out very early onwards without necessarily having that kind of full maturation. And that workshop that you talk about is actually the one that was called Pivoting Practices. Which was gathering, because there was always this idea that this is not something that can be articulated in isolation. And that workshop I remember very well, where the white dude that you're talking about is sacrilegiously Bruno Latour.
Yes.
Right? So there was this, if you remember, in the middle of the pandemic, there was this text that was circulated that said, we should stop everything, right? There is this kind of idea that the economical system had been stopped, everything had been stopped. Of course, not mentioning that a lot of other things were actually running. So, I mean, of course, there was a blind spot. And I remember that conversation very well, where you were like, I mean, this white dude telling me that I have to stop building, as a kind of really like, wow, kind of amazing moments of like really like bringing this conversation. What does it mean to call for a halt, right? Or a pause, or like even a stop, or an indefinite stop. As a really foundational moment, and that's why you find yourself very prominently featured as the second footnote in the book. With starts with like an IPCC report that says that addressing the needs for more residential buildings may not mean constructing new buildings, especially in the global north. So here you go with the kind of necessary scientific justification that we really have to think about this, and then your kind of profound reflection on what it means to call for a halt as an indigenous person, and also what it means also to think about these questions from the point of view of Western academia in that case. So I think it's really important that this is located here, and that conversation has been really pivotal to kind of think further, and it reappears again, and you also reappear with your work on the role of the non-important, as you call it, at the end in the chapter 9. So what I wanted to maybe do a little bit for you today was to read a short moments from the chapters, maybe as a kind of quick disclaimer. Those were the first. So those are the chapters. They operate in autonomy, so if you are not inclined to read 9 chapters in a row, you can also skip and jump. And the copy that you see here is actually Antoine. I want to thank also Antoine and Kathy and everyone for the setup, which I think is wonderful, by the way. And we talk also about the politics of space and how we organize as something that is also part of perhaps chapter 7, Reform the School. In any case, the kind of articulation of these chapters, they're actually from these very early moments of thinking about what it actually means to call for a stop of construction as a kind of almost clickbait also tool, right? Where it's like, oh, wait a minute, what is that? You know, like somewhere in there is someone who calls that a professional suicide. You know, there is a kind of really irritating aspect to that call, especially for architects, and the kind of the very task that is ours, which is to house everyone. So that's the second chapter, of course. And someone somewhere asked me whether there is a kind of importance to the order, and there is. Of course, house everyone is the second one, very importantly. Then it's less, maybe less hierarchized, but nevertheless kind of articulates the points of a sort of manifesto, right? Maybe the red cover kind of choice is not anecdotal in that sense. So yes, it is definitely a political project. And it used to be, so the titles have changed, the kind of calls have changed. I also posted on Instagram an old version that actually has halt extraction as shut the plantation and the mine as a kind of much more pointed articulation of what extraction actually means. So it's kind of profound racist kind of undertones, right? The kind of importance of that, and somehow I re-articulated as a kind of crisper title, but the content is basically the same. I also had Kill the Office as a 6th, which I also changed to Fix the Office, Not to Lose Friends. Actually as a joke, but also to say that I do believe that there are possibilities of repair also for the office. So it's just a kind of a semi-joke. So I will just take you through a few points, and I will be quite brief, as I hope that you would actually read it. So I'm trying not to do the job for you, and take you through some of them, some of these moments that I try to articulate. Maybe as a footnote before I dive in, as a footnote, matter of footnotes. When that idea that I mentioned at the beginning was basically thrown in online, it was also articulated as a syllabus for my class at GSD. It was screenshotted and thrown into what was at the time Twitter, and it was destroyed, right? So laminated. So there was like a kind of, I mean, that's what the internet does, right? It's kind of, there is that expectation, but it was like, who is this white woman in her white ivory tower calling for a stop to construction? Those were people in the Bay Area, which is undergoing a severe housing crisis. Of course, you know, they were kind of called, I should be fired. I mean, it's like kind of this really violent kind of attacks. And in a way, it was very constructive because it forced me to produce a lot of footnotes. In a way, I protected myself from this through, in a way, weaving, and this is something I would like to discuss with you afterwards, but like weaving a lot of existing knowledge as something to say, listen, this is not just my idea. A lot of people have been thinking about that. So if you want to destroy people, destroy all these other people, not just me. Anyway, and I've also tried to talk about citation politics. I've also tried to do justice to a lot of people who actually, among this conversation, have brought to the topic so much. You among many, but you know, actually many of the people who are here today will find themselves in the footnotes as well, because I found that it doesn't cost anything to put people in the footnotes and thank them for their work, which is something that at time in academia we tend to be a little reluctant and try to claim ideas as new, right? So there is a kind of maybe a sort of, let's say, more hidden agenda in that as well. Stop building. To build is to destroy. To construct anything sets a series of actors, events, and transactions with harmful consequences in motion. From funding and legislating to designing and organizing, construction propels the extraction, transportation, processing, and installation of materials, the allocating, inhabiting, exploiting, and commodifying of space, and finally the generation of waste via demolition. At every turn, there are corresponding adverse effects. Known ones, such as ecological devastation and greenhouse gas emission, but also lesser identified ones, such as debt production, speculative financing, exploitative labor conditions, socially destructive mining, health hazards, racial discrimination, resource depletion, eternal pollution. These other externalized forms of social and spatial injustice are just some of the many nefarious arrangements that yield the architectures of our lives. You will notice I have a slight tendency to iterations. I like lists. Until design and planning professionals have figured out how to change these devastating modes of engagements with the built and unbuilt environment, authorities everywhere should stop granting new buildings permits and enforce a construction ban. This is the premise of the proposed moratorium on new construction you hold in your hands. Such a call may seem drastic at first, but to address the massive, relentless, and senseless damage generated by construction and all its ancillary effects, a moratorium is unique in its clarity as a path towards the radical restructuring society urgently needs. As we problematize what, how, where, by, and for whom, and for how long we build, an indefinite pause will allow us to assess, mitigate, correct, and repair the harm generated in the construction of the present world, granting respite today while plotting the course for a different tomorrow. There are little hearts. How's everyone? The 223.5 billion square meters of building floor area that form the immense portfolio of human habitats to be mobilized toward less extractive ways of life. This is a rough estimate of the total amount of usable space within buildings worldwide. Distributed unevenly, this portfolio comprises all spatial volumes that are currently or could be inhabitable. Dealing with this global inventory of built mass holds many promises. Since housing undergirds inequality and through its provision, injustice, the redistribution, allocation, and adaptation of these spaces towards the right to housing promises emancipation from these forces, undermining lines of property, forces of capital, and demands for extraction. With this vision comes a new set of individual and collective responsibilities. A moratorium on new construction suggests that practitioners can organize to reclaim power, contributing to more equitable forms of spatial production simply by redeploying their professional abilities. It also centers redistribution and equitable access to housing as an agenda and a priority. All it requires is a harder look at the existing stock instead of continuing the devastating enterprise of building new. Change value system. The call to stop building points at the imperative need for the industrialized global north to massively reduce its consumption first and foremost. The radical change required is to completely discard extractive value systems as the guiding compass toward progress, rather than just transferring them in an ethical way. To shred the tails of progress that shield architecture and engage in challenging construction protocols against the devastation they generate is to interrogate prevailing narratives and material choices. It demands establishing a conversation between the physicality of damage and domination and the ongoing course of things. There is no sustainable architecture, no architecture free from extraction. There are gradients of harm with which architects contend every day, all with a cost. That's too fast. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. You're going to have to listen to me. Fix the office. The call to stop new construction also demands referential reforms, to abandon the heroic figure of the architecture genius once and for all. Not only because the single authorship of buildings needs to be interrogated, but also because the figure of the master is tightly attached to the trope of newness. Steering the practice of architecture toward post-extractive designs and resource stewardships means letting go of this posture of the prodigy architect. The consequences of this abandonment are profound. Canons are to be dismantled, hierarchy suspended, expertise questioned, authorship expanded, and design processes reinvented. The latter entails a radical rematerialization and reconceptualization of space. Reform the school, and this will be the last. Stop building is a contentious brief for the school of the present. For architecture, a discipline directly preoccupied with envisioning and building up the future, as are urban planning, civil engineering, and to an extent, material sciences and geology, questioning its raison d'être can only be met with discomfort. But architectural education has many means to evolve and continue redefining itself. Some of these reform alleys include adopting a cautious approach toward technology and techno-fixes, recognizing its impact on architectural practices and coming to terms with the responsibility of architecture as a spatial ordering tool. This includes seeing that our tools are powerful. For instance, the production of images must come with an awareness of how these shape the future and accountability for the narratives they create. A moratorium on new construction is perhaps ironically constructive, as it seeks to articulate a new world-making project for architecture. When new construction stops, the task of the discipline of the built environment is to enter into the repairing, reparations, remediations, mending, reshuffling, undoing, subtracting, and maintenance of our existing stock. It can reinvent itself entirely. In this configuration, educational institutions have the paramount task of imparting political and operational literacy, teaching and learning the art of unbuilding and rebuilding societal and physical structures, and designing and enabling the urgent change required to edit the construction sector. There are 2 more chapters, but I leave it at that. Go back to this. Oh, and this is the work of Lara Almesegui, who's an artist. It's called The Rubble Mountain. All right. Shall we have a chat?
Yes.
Okay. Maybe just to kind of jump back on this aspect of like weaving content. So I mentioned like the kind of the task of picking up things that others have actually articulated already and then trying to maybe make a new, oh my God, it's happening, another idea, or to kind of articulate this as a kind of practice. We had discussed a bit yesterday about this idea of like this weaving as a kind of feminist practice.
Yes, and it's not just weaving. It's weaving with threads from different worlds. Because the issue in knowledge and scholarship is that we often sit in a Western epistemic ground. And then when we try to speak to other epistemic grounds, we either completely disconnect or think about it as something out of history. Right? I just took my students to Egypt, and when we came back, some of them said, well, Nubians do this, but in modern times we do this. We were there 2 weeks ago. Why would you think this world is in the past? Like, and you are in the modern time. So what makes this work really remarkable to me is not just that the fact that it claims lineage, but while bringing all these thoughts. So you're basically making your family here. This is your thought of family. But this idea of being able to braid and weave knowledge that comes from different epistemic grounds, different worlds that can sit together, while the universalist tendencies that we get out of the Enlightenment comes with the colonial projects of epistemicide, right? It's only that one world that can live. We can't really live with others. So that made it possible for you thinking from a Western institution and but also bringing in and engaging with indigenous land epistemologies, thinking about rivers rematriated and rivers with personhood, in like writing through different fields of meaning and bringing them together to weave. And it's not about something new. Again, it's this like the whole idea of the curator. It's like we are so obsessed with creation in architecture, while actually our work is service, not creation. But this is why it makes it, to me, so strong, because the two things you do, which is you cite a lot of people back to back. Like these are all the people, and also look at the list of your thank yous at the end. Like, this is the longest list of thank yous I've ever seen in any book ever. And then your lists as well, the fact that, which comes with a bit of a kind of a lack of care for the consumer of the book. So there are light brains, not, you're just going to tell me all these disasters back to back? Maybe just give me two things and then speak about them, and then go engage with two other things. So you're going to speak about extraction and disposition and displacement and gentrification and all these things all back to back. So but coming in together and thinking that weaving requires complexity. Weaving as well, quilting, for example, and braiding and quilting and weaving come also with materials that are salvaged or brought from different places, and they can sit together and they can allow us to do something different with them. So this point in there, especially, for example, when you are, okay, I'm going to pull the book now and we're going to have the whole discussion. So in the note on rivers, now I don't have it here. It's okay, I remember it. But on the note, when you speak about materials and you bring in land politics, like indigenous land politics, into a project that starts from a Western ground, or you're sitting on European lands, and then speaking about the relevance and the importance of rivers' personhood to the project of architecture. While it's not. What did I do? Okay, it's my earring. Okay, sorry for that.
It's good that everyone is like.
Great, woke you all up. But the idea here that the knowledge weaved brings in a different political project and excludes this idea of universality. The world is bigger, and our work of worlding can use all these threads of allyship and camaraderie of knowledge. So this to me is such a big methodological upside of this project.
I think I'm very grateful that you say that the lists are okay.
Oh, I love the
I'm
lists.
a little bit sad because I had my editor at one point was like, that list of like 40 verbs at the beginning of chapter 4, can you like cut that down? And then I was very sad, so I put it in a footnote. Drilling, breaking, detonating, harvesting, cutting, planning, laminating, crushing, milling, grinding, shredding, mixing, pelletizing, sintering, smelting, heating, dissolving, filtering, electrolyzing, melting, spinning, foaming, refining, casting, shaping, rolling, firing, annealing, steaming, pouring, polishing, staining, sandblasting, heating, blazing, sanding, fitting, fastening, bonding, extruding, extracting, excavating, unearthing. Human subject, raw matter, an entire landscape to an abundance of actions to manufacture construction materials. So I had to put all that in the footnotes because the editor was like, so I had to cave in. But I think that the iteration in a way does that work of kind of saying, do we realize even the amount of violence that we subject the materials that then become, the architecture of our lives as a kind of, as you said, non-respect to the reader who has to go through that and kind of suffer through this.
A consumer of
Yes,
your book.
exactly. And maybe to kind of bring that back to the kind of what did you say earlier about the? Sorry, I have a blackout. I should have taken notes. I'm too.
No worries.
I'm too. Yes, I wanted to bring that back to the legal aspect. So there is something about the fact that actually a moratorium is a legal tool, which maybe, I mean, the fact people have said or called for a stop to construction, you know, many times, and actually they're in the book also in the beginning, the kind of acknowledgement that, I mean, I'm not the first one who say we should just do this differently, but to kind of articulate it as a legal tool potentially is something that was very important to me because, in fact, I think that you had mentioned that in the pivoting practices, but the kind of weaponization of environmental laws as something that, you know, it's like this arguments of like bees but not migrants, you know, like the discussion on how moratoria as they are today are not necessarily coming from a good place, meaning they can be also manipulated. And I also talk about that. But I'm interested also in kind of maybe thinking with you about how these legislative tools can be taken serious. I guess there is maybe a question of that, whether a call, you know, like if it's kind of an artist call that say, you know, we should stop doing that, but like maybe the articulation of it as a legal framework, as something that is and has there is a risk. I mean, this is something that is very important to me, is that and that's maybe why the cover is red. So there is a kind of political signaling of sorts that it shouldn't be. And I think once you open the book, that's very clear. But like, I was once contacted by a very right-wing newspaper that wanted me to talk about it, which I declined, but signaled to me that a moratorium on new construction is something that can be very easily weaponized for, you know, as environmental laws and things like that against inclusive agendas. So I'm just throwing this out because I know that you've been also thinking about these environmental laws, and I wonder, you know, where you locate that project maybe in that thinking.
Well, I look at legal structures in general through a critical race theory lens, because critical race theory teaches us that even race as a category, all these categories of extraction are written into law. They exist because they are enforced and they were articulated into law. So legal instruments are very important to kind of govern this, and if we can tackle them somehow, it should be a priority. So as architects, we often think that it's not our business to deal with these things, but I feel like it's really our business. And if there is any pretense of democracy wherever we live, we should actually use that and start pressuring to get laws and legal structures written towards our political projects or towards the kind of the grounds that we are trying to pave and build. However, we also see that these legal structures, especially through greenwashing, I think greenwashing is probably, to me, or laws that basically pretend to be there for the environment, but they are actually there to restrict use or facilitate use to certain capitals in certain areas, is to me probably the biggest culprit in the continuous colonization of land. Because these laws end up being like, oh, you cannot build here unless you meet this very high kind of a rule, and this rule requires you to have $50 million in capital. So if you are a community that is trying to build together, if you're trying to have your annual festival there, if you are trying to have livelihoods from the grassroots, there is no way you can reach that because there's environmental protection laws that makes it very difficult for you to be there. It's just you need to have 50 million. You need to be able to spend $3 million on a certain device or a certain kind of environmental impact report to be able to occupy this land. So to me, and it is very to me, it kind of touches home because our land, Nubian land, after our displacement, every time my people try to go back, they produce a new environmental law to push any human inhabitant far away from the river. We are river people. We have been living near this river for, what, 11,000 years, and then the river has been our father and our deity, and now we are the danger to this river. Actually, the fact that our people have not been there for a long, long time, this environment has had a lot of disruptions, and capital has access to it. So who is by the river? All these big agro businesses who are from the Arab Gulf, who just are here for cheap water. So you see how these systems are so insidious, and it doesn't make it that we need to be far away from them. It makes it that we need to claim them. So when we go and speak about moratoria, we need to think about these moratorias with cracks within them for the light to come in, right? For the grassroots to blossom, for people to be able to world outside of the realms of construction and outside of the realms of capital.
I have a beautiful example for you that one of my former students, Elsa Maki, sent me at one point, which is a moratorium on new construction in Beverly Hills.
Interesting.
And actually, it's a judge, so it's kind of a county judge that blocks construction permits except for affordable housing. And they said you will be able to start building again your luxurious villa once you have achieved your quota of affordable housing in Beverly Hills, which is maybe one of these cracks, right? Which is like, actually, it's not about not constructing at all, but it's about the kind of instrumentalization in that sense of new construction for the benefits of that. And maybe to kind of wrap up, and I think maybe it would be nice to also take some thoughts or opinions from the public. I think that one of the work that we're trying to do now with the studio is embracing norms as kind of a way to think of how architects can be of service if they sit in the rooms that are currently occupied by construction materials producers, and I'm going to name them. So the SEA norms are, for instance, the guardians of a certain construction material economy within Switzerland, and they're very scary. They're designed and written in ways that they're very difficult to understand. They're very technical. They're basically gatekeeping devices for whoever would maybe want to challenge that you need to have 17 centimeter of insulation made of polyester around your house so that you have comfort. But maybe that there are other ways to reach that. And so, yeah, maybe just to kind of, as a kind of way of thinking about the agency of designers beyond the new, beyond maybe form making, and maybe the kind of slightly unsexy labor of sitting in these rooms and engaging with this very dry and indigest, I don't know how to say it in English, but very difficult to digest kind of material as also one of the maybe potential. And maybe you can expand on this, I don't know, the agency or this kind of service, right, that I think you already hint towards.
It comes back to this point of laws, right? Because these norms are the equivalent of enforceable building laws,
but it's
right?
a parastatical institution, right?
This is very, very interesting for me. The fact that, and also it's a huge opportunity here, the fact that your legislation of building codes, which is the equivalent of a building code, which are the norms, here are actually a parastate organization, which means it's a critical mass. It's a critical mass of practitioners like yourself or people who have inserted themselves in it, aka producers of materials, who ended up eventually defining these codes to their interest. I think it means all of you need to graduate, subscribe, sit on all these boards, have a volunteer on all these committees, and be there and push back. while all these norms are being changed, and start new things, redirect things, redefine things. That is amazing. For where I live and work, for example, all these are defined by a state agent. The provincial government decides the building code. However, they create committees, and most of the people who sit on these committees are developers. So they were able to make it easier for themselves to build, cheaper for themselves to build, but the houses are still more expensive. So people who write the laws write them for their own benefit, which means it's our responsibility then to try to push back around against these norms and laws and be on the table and try to write them. And you have a better chance than me here in Switzerland. You have a much better chance than us trying to kind of insert ourselves into the provincial government.
Maybe just one last thing, because and it's something you had mentioned yesterday about to end on a kind of and open up to what it means in terms of discipline to kind of call for a stop to construction. But I also want to ask you to kind of maybe mention this the failure of the discipline for you, right? So I'm not in a kind of not as the discipline like being a failure, but the fact that the architecture discipline, and maybe this is also hinted towards that, as a labor of someone who thinks that architecture can do better. So as maybe as opposed to like walking away, right? I think that, and this is a conversation we have a lot in the studios where a lot of students are actually kind of tempted to walk away, right? Because so much of the discipline or the disciplinary kind of underpinnings are connected to this harm generation, right? But so as opposed to doing that, as someone who has suffered extensively in my studies and kind of like needed to rebuild some kind of relationship to architecture, as someone who's practiced also extensively and really, in the kind of very subordinated role of doing, plans about how the tiles in the bathrooms are located and where the soap holder is going to be. So I really, I know the grueling labor that comes into that, and I was always kind of feeling that something was really wrong with that. But also kind of like saying, well, it doesn't have to be like that. I think that maybe that is one of the contributions that this book is trying to make, which comes from a place of affection for the discipline, right? So and there I know that you have a slightly different position, and if not an opposed one, but no. I think that you also haven't walked away, right? So I think I just want to maybe open up that can of worm so that we can then throw it to the audience.
Yes, I am an architect through and through. I know a lot of my colleagues who started doing research, diverted towards arts and became artists, and their practice became around exhibitions. I can't do that. I need to be an architect, but I need to be an architect that my grandmother would be proud of. I would like my foremothers or my ancestors to be proud of me from their graves, knowing that I'm doing the right work, making communities, making lives, making the architecture of a good life. However, and I'm going to throw this back to you, I think for me to do it, for all of us to do that, we need a lot of disciplinary disobedience. We need to go and learn about laws and learn about materials and learn about geology and learn about extraction and learn about chemistry and so many things that we have to kind of get out of our comfort zone, but come back to where we are and kind of, to me, I cherish the fact that I'm an architect and I'm an architect like my grandmother. However, I'm going to throw this back at you. How many times since you stopped doing architecture practice, as in doing shop drawings at 1 to 5, and you started thinking about moratoria, how many times were you told that you're not an architect anymore?
So that's something I pushed back on that like 2 days ago. I was in a panel and say, oh, but you as someone who's walked away from practice, and I was like, I'm sorry, I haven't walked away from practice. Yeah. First of all, I think that there is a kind of deeply problematic kind of dichotomy between the ones who think and don't build and the ones who build assuming they don't think. So I find this always kind of shocking that people who are themselves like, you know, very closely practitioners would subscribe to that, because it means that you're just a kind of, you know, executioner or something. And then what is a practice, right? So I also very strongly claim a critical spatial practice. I also actually practice, so I also have like a I actually have a confidential practice, which makes me a nightmare for the people that I work with, because, for instance, I had a fight with the person I work with on a renovation project, which comes from already the objection of demolition. So I already kind of put my foot down and was like, we don't have to demolish, let's spend a huge amount of free labor in thinking about how we can actually do this differently, and so on and so forth. And then, so it's about locating where the construction material is going to be stored and where the cranes and everything is going to come. And then there is this poor tree in the middle. So the magnolia, I managed to get relocated. I was like, the magnolia, no. And now it was in bloom, so everyone was like, okay, fine, we'll relocate the magnolia. So Swiss construction money. So, okay, fine.
Yeah, I was like,
we'll relocate the magnolia, but that, it's an if, I don't know the term, like it's the tree of eternity or something like that. People don't like it. It's like one of these trees that was in fashion in the 70s, but now it's kind of like not so much. It doesn't bloom, you know, it doesn't have that beauty kind of element, but still a tree. Like it's home to species, to like, you know. And so the discussion was, I said, okay, but the tree will cut, and I was like, excuse me, like, who gives you the right to speak above that non-human, right? In the middle of a construction meeting, right? So the kind of discussion about the non-human, it's one thing to talk about the non-human in the classroom where you're like, building about the non-human. It's another to kind of bring that in a meeting with the FAR planners who are like, what is she talking about? You know, like, and there is I really want to say that this is also this kind of like trying to stay close to practice, to be in practice, and at the same time bring that kind of agenda and not oppose those, but in the contrary, kind of like bring them in construction. But you're right. People have accused me of, like, I think Jürgen Mayer, which is a friend, I said, oh, you know, stop building, ha ha ha. And it was like, oh, it's funny, for you, it's not a problem, you've never started. You know, this is the kind of, I mean, he meant it in a cute way, but at the same time, it kind of reveals exactly what you say. It's like, yeah, it's easy for you to say stop building. You know, you're not in the everyday. It's like, well, maybe I am, and so does it legitimize this discussion, right? So,
I think it's the hardest thing for me is that I would like to be an architect, but not a mercenary. So how can I be an architect that does not just listen and do as what I'm told? Am I displacing somebody? Am I cutting trees? Am I taking habitat from worms? And the one story that always strikes me is was told to me by one of the Algonquin elders in Ottawa, and she was telling us about white pine and the fact that our entire campus, our campus has been a big forest of white pine trees. And then she said, but you did the deer dirty. And I was like, why? Her name is Annie Smith and George, and she's amazing. And she said because all this area was for the deer to go and scratch their back, and that's a kind of a therapeutic and healing process for them. They get the warts out of their back by scratching it on white pine, because this is what the white pine trunk has had, all these grooves, and they can just scratch their back. And now you have taken all this health center away from the deer and to make it your campus. So the fact that we don't see that this was actually a functioning health center for another being, and we thought there's nothing there. This blindness that we have when we think there's like, when you see the tree and then they wanted to cut the tree. I grew up with a tree being like your cat in the house. We had a tree in the middle of our house, and it was a part of the family. So there's even re-understanding this and trying to speak to them, and they would say, oh yeah, you're naive. If you speak about this, you're naive. But, well, it does not make me stop talking about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We're not going to shut up.
We're not going to shut up. Shall we open to the audience? I'm sure there are comments or questions, Sasha.
So Charlotte, thank you very much. I'm a big fan of this work. We started the discussion with what you mentioned, Menna, as an example of a building definition, building code, etc. But when we look at the book, this is revolutionary stuff. And if you want to do half of what is written in the book, and we should do at least half, perhaps more, we need to change not just the building code, but the tax code and the way we use energy and governance.
Yeah.
Why should someone who has a piece of paper that says private property make decisions against the interest of a community? What do we value in life? What is a good life? So how do we go from something that looks rather technical in one discipline to this becoming a seed of changing the whole society?
Well, you start.
Well, from my perspective, I blame your ancestors. So from my perspective, it's the colonial projects that came into some of these lands. So the land I live on in Ottawa, for its indigenous people, you don't own land, the land has you. You don't have land, the land has you. But that change in meaning was enforced. So yes, that what is needed is a decolonial revolutionary project. And then I think starting in the school is a very good start, radicalizing all the kids around, because they know that it's also their future. All the students, I feel like architecture students are our biggest allies in this project, because it's their future, it's their environment, it's their economy, it's their lack of access to housing, it's their profession and lack of access to jobs and to jobs that they want to do and having to do something while really dreading it. So yes, it is as a political project that requires a big revolution.
Maybe just as a kind of footnote, I think that one of the biggest achievement, I mean, it's funny is that this book wasn't out and he's been talked about extensively. So I was also a bit like, okay, everyone's going to get disappointed. It's just a book, right? But the kind of the call, right, for a stop to construction as being something that was coursing across the discipline as something that has been discussed and kind of, with or without agreement, right? But discussed. I remember one of our representative in the Swiss Parliament, Adèle Torrance, who was sitting with me in a panel, saying, I can guarantee you that the Swiss Parliament is not ready for a moratorium on new construction, which I was like, yeah, kind of thinking about that. But the fact that this is actually something that is being discussed as a serious thought is a signal that things have to move faster, which in a way to me is already a kind of big push towards, whatever that kind of project is trying to achieve.
Thank you very much for this fantastic book. I'm looking forward to read it and the commentaries. I wanted to come back to the question of the world making, because I was not worried about, but a little bit concerned about the potential dichotomizing effect of your writing, because I fully agree with the fact that we need to discuss and defend a moratorium on new construction, to go against some form of capitalist extraction and to some form of building model as a way Tim Ingold develops it as a way of imposing ideas to material. But in the same time, what I really would like to stress is the fact that, as Ingold also stresses, the fact that we can have also a conception of building as something as growing, and because of this renovation can be also violent. And so what we need is probably to go from extraction to picking. And it's important because there are forms of extraction which are the traditional picking and which are important. In Mumbai, they want to erase inhabited forests. They want to make a sanctuarium of forest, and so they want to remove indigenous tribes that have been living there for centuries, and so they can live in a forest and pick in it without being extractivist, and in the same time, renovation can be very violent in a capitalist sense, and so we need to think maybe of building as growing. And if we like to start to look at building as growing, as Ingold calls us to do in his dwelling model, then it's not a matter of opposing building and renovation or being a new, but it's supporting two ways of violent building or violent renovation to caring, growing of solid structure. Because I'm a sociologist, but I really like to work with architects because they allow me to grow solid structure and robust and inclusive structures. And I don't want to lose that, and we cannot just wait to keep the old church or the old solid structure of the past that we have been protecting us, but we want to be able to grow some new one. And so the moratorium to building, I think it's an important political step, but in an epistemological perspective, I think it's important to bring together the act of new construction and renovation into a post-capitalist and post-extractivist but not post-peaking and not post-growing perspective. And that's just a point, but it doesn't, I believe the political project is important and I support it.
I'm glad. Yes, I mean, just maybe as a footnote, I think that if you look at the way construction is really happening today, this is what I'm talking about when I say we have to stop construction, the kind of violence of, just you be pouring concrete, tons of concrete, and the kind of wrapping up buildings in plastic, cutting trees for OSB plates that you find everywhere, the kind of the real, let's say, the most mainstream way of constructing as the culprit for what's, 40% of carbon emission. And when I say that, I don't mean it as a kind of obscuring device. For me, it's just the tip of the iceberg, because there are all these kind of other violence that is not calculated because it doesn't fit. And we know that we cannot trust any of this life cycle assessment. I found out very recently that steel in concrete is actually not used in some of the calculation of LCA system. So, this is not to be trusted. So I am not talking in this call about the communities that are, doing picking. I think that's maybe going back to this environmental laws instrumentalization. I'm talking about, the big companies that produce all these materials, the one that sits on these norm-making boards, the one that don't really care about any of this and just kind of, propel the construction narratives, right? I mean, in there I also talk about briefly, and it's kind of maybe a more dialectical kind of question, but the way that we rely on new construction as a tool for solving everything, to me, is what part of this kind of really problematic way. Like if you think about the way that politicians market themselves, from François Mitterrand, wonderful pyramids in the Louvre, to, Quai Branly, de Jacques Chirac, kind of colonial receptacle for stolen art as something that is left as a legacy, and then, Erdogan announcing a new airport, the wall of Trump back in the days. I mean, all this kind of new construction as political project that will solve everything from unemployment to housing is just something that is so prevalent that, of course, I'm not talking about the people doing picking in their forests that are being like pushed out by environmental laws, and that this would not be part of that. I'm really seeking to tackle, the kind of overall narrative of new construction as something that is really, destructive to the point of. That's why I'm annoyed when people also say, "Oh, this is so radical," and I'm like, "Well, I'm sorry, but have you contended with the reality. I mean, our students this semester all went to see construction material production plants alone. So somebody went to a gypsum factory, which they told that student, who I hope is here, oh, we have to discard all these gypsum plates because they are slightly brown. So we're just throwing them all and then reproducing them, because the narratives of new constructions are also white. How symbolic, how more symbolic can you make that, right? So I think that there is really a need to assess the kind of scales of damage, right? So I think that to me this is really obviously not about, you know, what you mentioned, which is clearly not part of that. And I also don't cite Tim Ingold in my book.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here, and especially very excited to read your book. So I have a question that's about bias, and it's also about a really hard conversation that I have in the work that I do. I'm not a student currently, but the practice in which I operate in is essentially challenging a building that has to be built and rebuilt every year. So it's an existing building, and it's almost like you're performing surgery on it every year, like a giant puzzle. You add parts in, you remove parts out, the body stays the same. And the question that I constantly have is how to do it in the least violent way possible. The situation that I want to describe is that often in our work, like the work that I currently do, when it comes to essentially negotiating the parts that you want to preserve, repair, rebuild, there's a lot of bias to how that looks. When you are dealing with people that have, you know, systems where your clients, people who have quite a lot of money, want to, you know, not demolish and build anew, there's a lot of fixation on how something looks. They want something to be very polished, very clean, very Eurocentric. What that often means is that, like, how it's dressed is actually undermining to the actual mission of being in service of rebuilding it. You know, often, like, I have fights about materials, I have fights about color. You know, got into trouble for designing a red room because red is perceived in Europe as a color of war, and, you know, or as a color that is challenging in spaces that are often diplomatic, right? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the thought of bias, and especially when you're operating in spaces that are financed very well in the global north, in the west. There's this big reluctance to sort of build something or rebuild something that looks shabby, that looks sort of, you know, not proper enough, not dressed enough. And I think often it's a very lonely conversation I have in those spaces, because often ideas that are brought to the table are dismissed as frumpy, as not complete, even though they are probably more caring.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'll divert a little bit. There is an article by an architecture historian who works with video game designers. And then she works with video game designers on building environments within their, especially Assassin's Creed, the ones that have a little bit of a that need kind of a historic background to them. And they are very critical of architects because we are so sanitized. We need to sanitize everything. And they want the mud in there, and they want the footprints, and they want the life. And we need everything to be sleek and cut. And so there is this kind of sanitization and a kind of a control aspect within our practice that you're seeing there. And what you can do about it is goddamn nothing. And I'll tell you why. Because you had been thrown within this system, and then you have been out of the educational system into practice that looks this way, that where money talks. You basically need to be there to pay the rent and have a career and have social upward mobility, right? This is the contract, social upward mobility for you to be an architect and go there and get training and all these things. So you're not going to be able to change the value system from your position. So I think this is something I tell all my students who work, for example, for the lab and do all this work for communities, and then people choose what they want, and then they take down all our fancy designs, and they just want the thing that looks like a Disneyland hut instead of the fancy wood soffits and stuff. So they go back to the market and say, oh, it's just depressing me because I have to go and do all these things for all those rich people. And I tell them, pay the rent. Just don't lose your disgust to that system. Pay your rent, but understand that there is a flaw in that system that has you work within this framework. I don't think there is anything you can do, and I don't think you cannot challenge from your position that meaning, but keep it in mind that after you garner enough power to keep pushing against these systems. But again, there's nothing you can do about it. Sorry for that.
It's good advice.
I can just pick up. I think in a way it's a question about aesthetics of change also, which is a conversation we had like 2 hours ago with a group of students who was trying to do reuse, and I was just mentioning how in a crit last year, one established architect said to another very famous architecture office who does a lot of reuse that their architecture is shit, and what it actually means to basically discount these aesthetics of change, which are really trying to build out of existing materials and basically put form as a kind of backseat element in architecture, which is something that's not always appreciated, is an understatement, but so I think that's basically what you're contending with. So maybe there is also a possibility that at one point the kind of narratives of what is acceptable be challenged and kind of arrive in this kind of framework you find yourself into, which sounds brutal, by the way, and where you can actually advocate for things. And I think there maybe the trickster figure can come handy. Don't know how, with the fact that you can try to be cunning about certain things and kind of also slid in some things that you think are acceptable to you and that maybe sell it in a way that might work for your clients as well as something that is a bit of a dishonest practice, which I also find extremely important. I mean, you talk about disobedience. I mean, I think this is something we should also have to acknowledge that, you know, there is also a possibility to sneak in stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I would like to bring an example, which is to a certain extent also to testimony that I witnessed somehow from the experience, a kind of moratorium of construction, because I'm in my home country, Tirana in Albania. There was many years ago, basically the mayor of the city who came to won the election. He came to basically won the election because he promised a moratorium on construction for the following 4 years, which quite of happened to be possible in the sense that for 4 years there was nothing that was possible to build, and it was done by basically not giving construction permits to people that were interested to build, which generated something kind of a sort of shock for architects, of course, because they would have less jobs, but it turns to kind of reinvent themselves, because many architects turn to the interior, so designing tiles became a new somehow fashion, but also became very good architects, like very specialized in interiors. For example, there was a spread of bars, so architects were being very good in designing very fantastic bars, which I mean was less invasive to the territory, but at least from the environmental point of view, there was, let's say, the air was quite clean. It remained quite clean for a while. Then there was another, let's say, election after 4 years where the left wing this time, this one was the right wing actually who promised the moratorium. The left wing actually proposed not a moratorium, but he said that we'll have a zero beton, which means that we'll not build anything with concrete. So zero beton means actually in our country that will not be any construction at all. So it was the same. When basically it came to, I mean, when he won the election with this promise, unfortunately he found himself within a situation where, in the meantime, from the previous, let's say, legislation, many, let's say, future oligarchs or big owners and companies of construction, but especially of real estate, they were kind of at the same time as a counterposition restructuring themselves, in the sense that they were buying more properties. So which means that there was a lot of pressure, even in terms of finance and rent, to the next government, but even to the current one, I guess. And what happened is that the second mayor that promised no construction, unfortunately had to break his promise because it was too much pressure. And this provoked a huge boom of skyscrapers, very, let's say, speculative high-rise towers in order to mark, actually, to gentrify the downtown of the city. So, which is a precedent in a way that, I mean, a very good moment. It lasted for only 4 years, unfortunately, but it provoked something that was lying behind, which was actually capital, or rentier capital, which lives through basically property, private property, was restructuring itself as a kind of opposition to that. So the question would be, I mean, on the light of these precedents, but I think that there are many others from history that we can also catch with more or less the same results somehow. Would you think that it would be more radical, instead of just saying a moratorium on construction, to say a moratorium on what actually makes construction companies do their construction, which is land property or private property especially?
There is a kind of argument made, and thank you for this great example about Albania that I didn't know, but at one point I had to stop adding new things about moratorium because there are actually so many, in fact, so I'm sorry that this one is not there, but it sounds like something that I could have made it. The kind of, the fact I was mentioning, the fact that the second chapter is house everyone, so I think the kind of course, underlying argument about stop building is also to somehow guarantee housing for all, and there is definitely a question of property as something that would need to be reassessed or readdressed or suspended, and there are also fantastic existing example of how that has been done with more or less success, of course. I mean, the decree on land, 1917, is a very good example that had, like, let's say, difficult consequences because it didn't come with the apparatus of offering, you know, housing as it should have, and led to kind of very, you know, unpleasant living situations and things like that. But of course, there are more cunning examples, again, to go back to the trickster, with, for instance, the precedent of the 2008 housing, or let's say banking crisis in the US, where basically the state became de facto the owner of thousands of homes through mortgage guaranteeing. So in a way, a huge amount of property in the US is actually still indirectly in the hands of the state through the kind of guarantee of mortgage, which I think for me is one example of how these things could be investigated further as the kind of renationalization of housing as a project that doesn't need to be called like that, but is actually the case. So even the current, you know, U.S. government has not rescinded that support. So those mortgage kind of holding companies called Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae are still basically hold in the portfolio of the state through the guaranteeing of their mortgages, which is, I think, maybe something not directly addressing questions of, like, you know, capital and mortgage and, like, all of that, but speaks to mechanisms that may not be frontally stripping property from people, but actually rethinking about how they are other mechanisms that can do that. I mean, I think this is, so I actually, so I guess I'm a kind of hopeless romantic at the time when I think about how the state operates, knowing very much that the state has, you know, is, you know, not exactly the most prescient agent, especially currently, and we can see how that's undone, in fact. I mean, the fact that it's being undone, I think, is a sign that actually it could be really powerful in other ways. But I think that, for instance, the discussion on, like, how to nationalize certain infrastructure. And here I'm not alone with this. I mean, I had a conversation last week with Kate Crawford, and she talks about how AI should be a nationalized infrastructure, for instance. So I think that the conversation on how to seize back some of the kind of basic infrastructures that we have is actually a conversation that surprisingly is gaining much more traction than one would think at this time of like, destructive federal or like federal undoing at times and things like that. But maybe you also want to.
Well, I don't have that same faith in state.
I know.
I do not have that same faith, especially in times when citizenship is in a very frail position. How to be a citizen, who gets to be a citizen, and different discounted humanities, structural racism affecting, as we see, citizenship means nothing. Trump wants to deport his own citizens. He wants to deport naturalized American citizens now, right? So I don't really see that as the way to go. However, I also think sitting on round tables within the state and trying to change laws. So I see this as a great precedent to work doing something that looks like an abolitionist project, but it actually deals with symptoms and instead of core meaning, right? So this is a struggle over meaning. So if you're going to actually have a national or municipal or provincial moratorium on building, you need to really adjust property law, because the problem is not that people are building. The problem is that there is this ontological structure that is, by the way, not something that is common all over the world. Most of the world did not have this property. This construct of property was imposed on most of the world, especially the settler colonial countries like the one I live in. There were no property before the white man arrived. So the idea here that we issue a moratorium without actually tackling property laws made it that capital just reshuffled themselves. And they went from being builders of real estate to owners of real estate. The whole issue here was actually the definition of real estate that should have been tackled. And at that point, you would have created the cracks in the system for affordable housing through the grassroots to happen, for like additions and expansions into existing buildings, and thinking about, different kinds of families and different kinds of buildings instead of this kind of mass production of housing. So there was a lot of opportunities, but I see this as a great case study to, when we go back again and try to push for this, what are the other things that we need to push at? Citizenship laws, property laws, environmental laws. So many things need to be tackled for this to be a successful endeavor. And probably there are going to be a bunch of failures for similar projects in the coming 10, 15 years, if it happens, before we really get the formula for this. But that's what city is it again? Tirana, yes. I'm gonna go read about that.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I think it was a very interesting and I think really worth of this great book, which we'll all read. Thank you for the provocation, and thank you really for all of you for being here and really celebrating the release of the book. And for those of you that are here, there are drinks downstairs and copies of Charlotte's book, Red Book. So thank you so much.
Thank you.